They called her the desperate widow, but Thomas Garrett saw something different in her steady hands and the way she held her chin up despite the whispers that followed her down Main Street. Sarah Mitchell had been widowed for 8 months now, and the good people of Cedar Falls had decided she was getting too comfortable asking for charity work. What they didn't see was how she scrubbed floors until her knuckles bled, how she mended torn curtains with thread pulled from her own worn dresses, how she never took a single thing that wasn't earned through honest labor. The morning wind carried the scent of sage and dust as she walked toward the Garrett Ranch, her cleaning supplies bundled in a flour sack, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Thomas Garrett's advertisement in the general store had been brief and blunt. Housekeeper needed. Must be thorough. References required. Most of the town women had turned their noses up at the prospect of working for the grieving rancher who hadn't spoken to his neighbors in 2 years, but Sarah saw it differently. She saw opportunity where others saw only a man too broken to be bothered with. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Your comment helps our community grow stronger. Thanks, and let's get back to the story. The Garrett Ranch stretched across a valley that had once been the pride of Cedar Falls, its pastures green and cattle fat, its farmhouse painted white with blue shutters that caught the morning light like jewels. Now, as Sarah approached the front porch, she could see how grief had settled over the place like dust over abandoned furniture. The paint was peeling, the shutters hung askew, and weeds had claimed the flower beds that someone had once tended with loving care. She knocked on the door with 3 firm raps, the sound echoing hollowly through what sounded like empty rooms beyond. When Thomas Garrett finally opened the door, Sarah had to keep herself from stepping backward. He was a tall man, broader through the shoulders than she remembered from seeing him in town, but it was the look in his dark eyes that made her breath catch. He looked like a man who had been drowning for a very long time. "You're the Mitchell woman," he said, his voice rough with disuse. It wasn't a question, and Sarah nodded, keeping her spine straight despite the way his gaze seemed to catalog every mended patch on her dress, every callus on her work-worn hands. "Yes, sir. I'm here about the housekeeping position." She lifted her chin a fraction higher. "I brought references from Mrs. Henderson and the pastor's wife." Thomas took the folded papers she offered but didn't look at them. Instead, he stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. The smell hit her first, not unclean, exactly, but stale and closed off, like a house that had forgotten how to breathe. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that managed to penetrate the heavy curtains, and Sarah could see dishes stacked in the kitchen, laundry piled on chairs, and books scattered across surfaces that should have been clear. It wasn't the chaos of laziness, she realized with a pang of recognition. It was the chaos of a man who had simply stopped caring about the space around him. "When did you last have help?" she asked, setting down her bundle of supplies and automatically moving toward the nearest window to pull back the curtains. Light flooded the room, revealing the full extent of the neglect, but also the good bones beneath it all. The furniture was well made, the rugs thick and beautiful under their coating of dust, the walls solid and true. "My wife handled the house," Thomas said quietly, and Sarah heard the weight of those words, the way they carried the full story of his loss. "After she died, I tried to keep up with it, but the ranch takes most of my time, and I reckon I'm not much good at the domestic side of things." Sarah nodded, already rolling up her sleeves. "Most men aren't expected to be. That's what I'm here for." She turned to face him fully, noting the way he stood with his shoulders curved inward, as if protecting something fragile in his chest. "If you'll have me, Mr. Garrett, I can have this place set to rights in no time. I work hard, I don't break things, and I don't gossip about what I see in a man's home." Something shifted in his expression then, a flicker of surprise or perhaps relief. "The job pays $2 a week, plus meals if you're here during the day. I'm usually out with the cattle from dawn to dusk, so you'd mostly have the run of the house." "That's more than fair," Sarah said, though privately she thought it was generous to the point of charity. "Most cleaning work paid half that much. When would you like me to start?" "Now, if you're willing." Thomas moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. "There's one thing, Mrs. Mitchell. My wife's belongings are still in our bedroom. I'd be obliged if you'd leave them be for now." The rawness in his voice made Sarah's chest tighten with sympathy. "Of course, Mr. Garrett. I understand completely." After he left for the range, Sarah stood in the center of the main room and let herself really see the work ahead of her. It would take days to set everything right, maybe weeks to restore the kind of care this house had once known. But as she looked around at the beautiful bones of the place, the way the morning light fell across the hardwood floors, the sturdy craftsmanship in every joint and corner, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. She felt useful. She felt needed. She felt like she had found a place where her particular skills mattered. She started with the kitchen, clearing the dishes and scrubbing them until they gleamed, wiping down every surface until the room smelled of lye soap and sunshine instead of stagnation. The pantry was well-stocked but disorganized, cans and sacks jumbled together without thought. Sarah sorted everything, arranged it logically, made note of what was running low. In the bottom of a crate of potatoes, she found a recipe box wrapped in a faded kitchen towel. The cards inside were written in a woman's careful script, some spotted with flour and grease from long use. These had been loved recipes, used regularly by someone who took pride in feeding her family well. Sarah found herself lingering over a card for apple cake, imagining the woman who had written it, who had probably served it to Thomas on special occasions, or just because she loved to see him smile. The grief that lived in this house wasn't just Thomas's, she realized. It belonged to all the meals that would never be cooked, all the love that had no place to go, all the care that had died with the woman who had made this house a home. By the time Thomas returned for lunch, Sarah had transformed the kitchen and started on the main room. She had opened every window, beaten the dust from the rugs, polished the furniture until it gleamed, and arranged fresh wildflowers in a jar on the mantelpiece. The house smelled of beeswax and fresh air, and light danced across surfaces that had been hidden under neglect for too long. Thomas stood in the doorway for a long moment, his hat in his hands, his dark eyes moving slowly around the transformed space. "It looks..." He started, then stopped, his throat working as if the words were stuck there. "Different?" Sarah suggested gently, wiping her hands on her apron. "Like it used to," he said finally, and the sadness in his voice was so deep that Sarah felt it in her own chest. Before, she had prepared lunch using ingredients from his pantry and one of the recipes from the box, a simple beef stew that filled the kitchen with the kind of rich, homey smell that made a house feel lived in. As they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, Sarah noticed how Thomas ate, quickly and without real attention, as if food was just fuel and not something to be savored. It made her think of her own meals in the months after her husband died, how everything had tasted like sawdust and obligation. "This is real good," Thomas said after a few bites, and Sarah saw surprise in his expression, as if he had forgotten that food could be a pleasure. "It's your wife's recipe," Sarah said quietly. "From the box in the pantry. I hope you don't mind that I used it." Thomas set down his spoon and looked at her with something that might have been gratitude. She would have liked that. She always said food was meant to be shared, that recipes weren't worth anything locked away in a box. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. Thomas took another bite, chewing slowly this time, as if he was actually tasting it. "She would have liked you, I think. You've got the same way of making things feel settled." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest at the compliment, unexpected and precious. It had been so long since anyone had seen value in the things she was good at, the quiet domestic skills that kept life running smoothly. In town, the other women either pitied her for being reduced to cleaning other people's houses or envied her for finding steady work when so many were struggling. None of them saw what Thomas was beginning to see, that she had a gift for making spaces peaceful, for bringing order out of chaos, for creating the kind of environment where a person could rest and heal. Over the following days, Sarah settled into a rhythm at the Garrett Ranch. She arrived each morning as the sun painted the eastern sky pink and gold, letting herself in through the kitchen door that Thomas left unlocked for her. She would start coffee brewing and set about the day's work while he handled the morning chores with his cattle. By the time he came in for breakfast, the kitchen would be warm and welcoming, filled with the smell of fresh bread or biscuits, eggs cooked just the way he liked them, coffee strong enough to chase away the lingering shadows of whatever dreams had troubled his sleep. Sarah had learned to read Thomas's moods in the set of his shoulders when he walked through the door, in the way he hung his hat on the peg by the kitchen, in whether he met her eyes when she bid him good morning. On the hard days, when grief sat heavy on him like a physical weight, she would work quietly, speaking only when necessary, giving him space to carry his burden without the added pressure of social niceties. On the better days, when the loneliness seemed less crushing, she might mention something she had noticed about the house, a small repair that needed attention or a suggestion for improving the organization of his things. It was on one of those better days, nearly 2 weeks after she had started working for him, that Thomas lingered over his coffee instead of rushing out to the range. "You've made a real difference here," he said, his dark eyes taking in the transformed kitchen, the neat stacks of mended clothing, the way the morning light seemed to make everything glow with care and attention. "It's a good house," Sarah replied, refilling his cup from the pot on the stove. "It just needed someone to remember what it was meant to be." "I used to know," Thomas said quietly. "When Emma was alive, this place felt like the center of the world. Now most days it feels like a museum, full of things I can look at but not touch, memories I can't quite reach." Sarah settled into the chair across from him, cradling her own cup between her palms. "Grief has its own timeline," she said, thinking of her own journey through loss. "Some days you feel like you're healing, and some days it's like the wound is fresh all over again. But that doesn't mean you're not making progress." Thomas studied her face with the kind of attention that made her pulse quicken. "You talk like someone who knows." "My husband died of fever last winter," Sarah said simply. "One day he was complaining about a headache, 3 days later he was gone. I thought I knew what loss felt like before that, but I learned there are different kinds of grief, different ways of being broken." "Do you miss him?" Thomas asked, and there was something almost shy in the question, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to ask such a personal thing. "I miss having someone to care for," Sarah said after a moment of consideration. "I miss feeling useful in that particular way, like I was the most important person in someone's world. I miss the routine of looking after another person, the way it gave shape to my days." She paused, surprised by her own honesty. "I don't know if that's the same as missing him, exactly. Does that make me terrible?" "No," Thomas said firmly. "It makes you honest. Emma and I, we had a good marriage, but it wasn't perfect. She could be stubborn as a mule when she set her mind to something. and she had a way of rearranging my things when she cleaned that drove me to distraction. But I missed the weight of her head on my shoulder when we sat on the porch in the evenings. I miss having someone to tell about my day, someone who cared whether the cattle were fattening up properly or if the fence in the south pasture needed mending. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Two people who had learned that loss was not something you got over, but something you learned to carry. Sarah found herself noticing things about Thomas that she had missed before: the way his hands curved around his coffee cup, long-fingered and scarred from ranch work, but somehow elegant despite their calluses. The way his dark hair fell across his forehead when he leaned forward, making him look younger than his 33 years. The way his eyes warmed when he talked about memories that didn't hurt quite so much anymore. "I should get back to work," Sarah said finally, rising from her chair with reluctance. There was something dangerous about these quiet moments, the way they made her feel less like an employee and more like a friend, maybe even something more precious than that. "Sarah," Thomas said as she began clearing the breakfast dishes, and the sound of her name in his voice made her pause. "Thank you. For all of this. For making this place feel like home again." The warmth in his words followed her through the rest of the morning as she worked her way through the house, dusting and polishing, mending and organizing. She had claimed every room except the bedroom Thomas had asked her to leave alone, and the house was beginning to feel like the comfortable, well-tended home it had been meant to be. But it was more than just the physical transformation that satisfied her. It was the way Thomas had begun to smile more often, the way he sometimes hummed while he worked outside, the way he lingered over meals instead of bolting his food like a man afraid to take pleasure in simple things. Sarah was beating rugs on the back porch when she heard voices approaching from the direction of town. She recognized Mrs. Henderson's sharp tones even before she could make out the words, and her stomach clenched with familiar anxiety. The woman had been one of her references, but that didn't mean she approved of Sarah's current employment. If anything, Mrs. Henderson seemed to take Sarah's success as a personal affront, as if the widow's ability to find steady work somehow reflected poorly on the charity she had occasionally provided. "I still say it's not proper," Mrs. Henderson was saying to her companion, a woman Sarah didn't recognize. A widow woman working alone in a bachelor's house, spending all those hours with him day after day. "People are bound to talk. Has anyone seen anything improper?" the other woman asked, and Sarah could hear the curiosity in her voice, the eagerness for gossip that would enliven her day. "Well, no," Mrs. Henderson admitted reluctantly, "but it's the appearance of the thing that matters. That girl has always been too bold for her own good, and now that she's desperate for work, who knows what she might do to secure her position." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and anger that made her hands shake as she continued beating the dust from the rug. This was what she had feared, the whispers and speculation that followed any woman who dared to work outside the narrow bounds of what society deemed appropriate. It didn't matter that she had conducted herself with perfect propriety, that she and Thomas barely spoke beyond the necessities of her employment. The mere fact of their proximity was enough to fuel the gossip mill. "She's always been playing as a fence post," Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "I suppose she figures this is her best chance to snare a husband, even if it means compromising her reputation in the process." The cruelty of the words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had grown accustomed to being overlooked, to being dismissed as unremarkable, but there was something particularly cutting about hearing it said so casually, as if her lack of conventional beauty was a fact as obvious and unremarkable as the color of the sky. She pressed her lips together and continued her work, determined not to let the women see how deeply their words had wounded her. "Thomas Garrett could do better," the other woman said. "He's got a fine ranch, and he's still young enough to start over with a proper wife. Someone with breeding and looks to match his station." "Exactly," Mrs. Henderson agreed. "I've told him as much, though he doesn't seem inclined to listen to reason these days. That woman has him bewitched somehow, convinced him he needs her services when any fool can see he's just lonely enough to mistake gratitude for something deeper." Sarah's hands stilled on the rug beater as the implications of Mrs. Henderson's words sank in. The woman had spoken to Thomas about her, had tried to poison his mind against her with suggestions that Sarah was somehow taking advantage of his grief. The thought made her sick with shame and fear. What if Thomas began to see her through their eyes, as a desperate woman scheming to trap him into an unwanted marriage? What if he decided the gossip wasn't worth the trouble and dismissed her from her position? She was so lost in her worries that she didn't hear Thomas approaching until his voice cut through the women's chatter like a blade through silk. "Ladies," he said, his tone perfectly polite but cold enough to frost glass. "Is there something I can help you with?" Sarah turned to see him standing at the corner of the house, his hat pushed back on his head and his dark eyes fixed on Mrs. Henderson with an expression that would have made a wiser woman retreat immediately. But Mrs. Henderson had never been accused of excessive wisdom, and she seemed to take his question as an invitation to continue her character assassination. "We were just expressing our concern for your reputation, Thomas," she said with the self-righteous air of someone convinced she was performing a public service. "Having that Mitchell woman here day after day, without proper supervision, well, it's bound to cause talk." "Is it?" Thomas asked mildly, but Sarah could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands clenched at his sides. "And what sort of talk would that be?" "You know how people are," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice taking on a wheedling tone. They see a desperate widow working in a bachelor's house, and they assume the worst. For your sake and hers, it might be better to find more suitable arrangements. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah felt her heart sink as she imagined him weighing the woman's words, considering whether keeping her employed was worth the social complications. She began to prepare herself for disappointment, for the loss of the first job that had made her feel genuinely valued in months. Mrs. Henderson, Thomas said finally, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made both women fall silent. I appreciate your concern for my reputation, but I think you've misunderstood the situation here. Mrs. Mitchell isn't just my housekeeper. She's the best employee I've ever had, and frankly, this ranch runs smoother with her help than it has since my wife died. If people want to gossip about that, they're welcome to waste their time however they see fit. Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness but from a gratitude so intense it made her chest ache. Thomas had defended her, had spoken of her worth in terms that made her feel genuinely valued for the first time in longer than she could remember. As for Mrs. Mitchell's character, Thomas continued, his gaze never wavering from Mrs. Henderson's flushed face, I found her to be honest, hardworking, and respectful in every dealing we've had. If you have evidence to suggest otherwise, I'd be interested to hear it. If not, I'd thank you not to spread speculation about a woman who's done nothing but try to earn an honest living. Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, clearly unprepared for such a direct confrontation. Well, she sputtered finally, I certainly didn't mean to offend. We were only trying to help. I'm sure you were, Thomas said dryly. But I think I can manage my own affairs without assistance. Good day, ladies. The dismissal was unmistakable, and even Mrs. Henderson couldn't pretend otherwise. She gathered her skirts with wounded dignity and stalked away, her companion trailing behind with obvious disappointment at being denied the juicy gossip she had hoped to collect. Thomas watched them go before turning to Sarah, who was still standing frozen by the clothesline, the rug beater clutched in her hands like a weapon. I'm sorry you had to hear that, he said quietly. You didn't have to defend me, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. They're not entirely wrong, you know. People will talk. Let them talk, Thomas said firmly. I know what kind of person you are, Sarah, and that's all that matters to me. You've brought life back to this house, made it feel like a home again instead of a shrine to the past. I won't let a pack of gossips take that away from either of us. The intensity in his voice made Sarah's pulse quicken, and she found herself looking into his dark eyes with a new awareness of the man behind the grief-stricken widower. Thomas, she began, then stopped, unsure what she wanted to say. I know this complicates things, he said, moving closer to her, close enough that she could smell the scent of leather and sunshine that clung to his clothes. I know it puts you in an uncomfortable position. If you want to find other work, I'll understand. I'll even help you find something, give you references that would get you hired anywhere in the territory. Is that what you want? Sarah asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice despite the way her heart was hammering against her ribs. No, Thomas said without hesitation. It's not what I want at all. I want you to stay, Sarah. Not just because of the work you do, though that's part of it. I want you to stay because this place feels alive when you're here. I want you to stay because I sleep better knowing you'll be here in the morning, making coffee and humming while you work. I want you to stay because I've started looking forward to our conversations at breakfast, to the way you make me remember that there's more to life than just getting through each day. Sarah felt tears spill over her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of joy, of a hope she had been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. I want to stay too, she whispered. I want to stay more than I've wanted anything in a very long time. Thomas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and gently brushed the tears from her cheek with his thumb. Then stay, he said simply. Stay, and let's see where this leads us. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest Sarah could remember. She and Thomas settled into an easy intimacy that felt as natural as breathing, sharing meals and conversation, working side by side on small projects around the house and ranch. Thomas began teaching her about the cattle, showing her how to read the signs of sickness or injury, how to judge the quality of pasture grass, how to spot a cow that was ready to calve. Sarah shared her knowledge of preserving and cooking, showing him techniques his mother had taught her, recipes she had learned from other women over the years. They were careful to maintain propriety when others were around, but when they were alone, they allowed themselves small intimacies that spoke of deepening affection. Thomas would catch Sarah's hand as she served his coffee, holding it just a moment longer than necessary. Sarah would stand close to him as they worked together in the kitchen, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough to catch the scent of his shaving soap when he turned his head. The transformation in both of them was obvious to anyone who cared to look. Thomas smiled more often, laughed at Sarah's gentle teasing, hummed while he worked in a way that spoke of genuine contentment. Sarah carried herself with more confidence, spoke up more in their conversations, let herself believe that her opinions and feelings mattered to someone who valued her for exactly who she was. It was on a warm evening in late September, as they sat on the front porch watching the sun set over the valley, that Thomas finally spoke the words that had been building between them for weeks. I love you, Sarah, he said quietly, his hand finding hers in the gathering darkness. I know it might seem too soon, or inappropriate given how we met, but I can't keep pretending that what I feel for you is just gratitude or friendship. Sarah turned to face him, seeing the vulnerability in his expression, the fear that she might not return his feelings. "I love you too," she said, her voice steady and sure. "I think I started loving you the day you defended me to Mrs. Henderson, when you made me feel like I was worth something to someone who mattered." Thomas lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "You're worth everything to me," he said. "You brought me back to life, Sarah. You made me remember that being happy doesn't dishonor Emma's memory, that I can love again without forgetting what I had before. And you made me remember that I have value beyond just being useful," Sarah replied. "You see me, Thomas. Not just what I can do, but who I am. That's a gift I never expected to receive." They were married on a crisp October morning, with only the pastor and his wife as witnesses. Sarah wore her best dress, carefully mended and pressed, with wildflowers from the ranch woven into her hair. Thomas wore his Sunday suit, his hair slicked back and his boots polished to a high shine. They spoke their vows in voices that shook with emotion, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever trials lay ahead. The town gossips had plenty to say about the hasty wedding, but their whispers held less power now that Sarah had found her place as Thomas's wife and partner. She held her head high when she walked down Main Street, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and valued by the man who mattered most to her. When Mrs. Henderson made snide comments about desperate measures and convenient marriages, Sarah simply smiled and wished her a good day, too happy to be bothered by the woman's petty cruelty. As winter settled over the valley, Sarah and Thomas built a life together that was richer and more satisfying than either had dared to hope. They worked as partners in every sense of the word, sharing the responsibilities of the ranch and the house, making decisions together, supporting each other through the inevitable challenges that came with frontier life. Sarah learned to help with the cattle, to mend harness and tend sick animals. Thomas learned to appreciate the subtle arts of homemaking, to notice when Sarah had rearranged the furniture or tried a new recipe, to express gratitude for the 100 small ways she made their life more comfortable and beautiful. Their love deepened through the long winter evenings, through shared work and shared dreams, through the quiet intimacy of two people who had found their perfect match in each other. Sarah bloomed under Thomas's steady affection, becoming more confident and outspoken, more willing to express her own desires and opinions. Thomas grew gentler and more open, learning to talk about his feelings, to share his hopes and fears with the woman who had become his closest friend, as well as his beloved wife. By spring, when the wildflowers began to bloom across the valley and the cattle grew fat on new grass, Sarah was carrying their first child. She and Thomas would sit on the porch in the evenings, her hand resting on her growing belly while he talked about his plans for expanding the herd, for building additions to the house, for creating a legacy that would last for generations. They spoke of the future with hope and excitement, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The people of Cedar Falls gradually came to accept Sarah as Thomas's wife, though some never quite forgave her for proving that happiness could be found in unexpected places, with unexpected people. But Sarah had learned not to measure her worth by other people's approval. She had found something far more valuable than social acceptance. She had found love that saw past surface appearances to the heart beneath, partnership that valued her contributions, and a place where she belonged completely and without reservation. As she stood in her kitchen on a bright spring morning, preparing breakfast for her husband and feeling their child move beneath her heart, Sarah marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come to the Garrett Ranch as a desperate widow looking for honest work, and she had found so much more than she had ever dreamed possible. She had found her home, her purpose, and the love that would sustain her for all the years to come. In the end, Thomas had been right all along. What he needed most wasn't someone to clean his house or cook his meals. What he needed most was her heart, freely given and joyfully received, the foundation upon which they had built a love that would last a lifetime.